But if ungodly civil rulers cannot befriend the Church, out of any regard to true religion, what can their object be in extending favor to her? The children of this world are wise in their generation. All their noisy zeal for the Church and princely liberality to her are not blindly thrown away. They know what influence the Church and her ministers are capable of exerting on the public mind. They know that the Church is the most powerful engine on earth for directing the feelings and moving the will of the great body of the people. It has been, therefore, at all periods, one of the highest objects of their ambition to have the Church under their own exclusive management and control. The sum and substance of their policy has been this: make the clergy loyal and subservient, and by their means the people. Far be it from us to depreciate the legitimate influence which ministers of religion may exercise and are bound to exercise in preserving the order and tranquillity of a nation, and in repressing the unreasonable complaints and murmurs that are sometimes excited against the most salutary measures of government. In such cases they will use their uttermost efforts to remove prejudice and inculcate submission. They will exhort the people to, quote, render unto all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor, unquote. But the case is altogether different when irreligious and ungodly men stretch forth sacrilegious hands to the Church of God, that they may mold and fashion it to suit their own ambitious designs. When, after the example of the man of sin, and with an impiety not less daring, civil rulers claim the right of prescribing a creed or confession to the Church, and perhaps of enforcing submission to it by civil penalties, when they undertake to regulate the government of the Church, in virtue of a usurped supremacy over her, when they claim the right of nominating her office-bearers, or of authoritatively determining in whose hands that right shall be placed, when they control the meetings of ecclesiastical courts, convening, proroguing, or dissolving them at pleasure, or limiting them in regard to the matters discussed in them, when they tamper with the worship of the Church, loading it with rites and ceremonies, and disguising the beautiful simplicity of New Testament worship by pompous additions of human invention, when they interfere with the discipline of the Church, by admitting or excluding members, annulling ecclesiastical censures, or dictating terms of church fellowship, it is no time for the Church to truckle or succumb, but to address the rulers as the Apostle did, quote, whether it be right in the sight of God to hearken unto you more than unto God, judge ye, unquote. Quote, the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, unquote, shall no man take from us. It may perhaps be asked, might not all this be done to a church not in connection with the civil government? We answer, no. The thing is impossible. Who ever heard of a church not connected with the state, waiting on the civil rulers to receive its creed or its form of church government, or submitting to their dictation in regard to discipline or the appointment of its office-bearers? It should be carefully observed that a church never can be brought into bondage but by her own consent. She may be persecuted, but she cannot be enslaved. Her public assemblies may be interdicted, and her ministers cast into prison, and her members proclaimed outlaws and traitors, but all this does not rob her of her independence. Her allegiance and loyalty to her one Lord may be as leal and hearty under these distressing circumstances as when she enjoys undisturbed tranquillity. The Neros and Domitans of the first age could desolate, and lay waste the church, but it was thought the perfidy of her own office-bearers and the insidious friendship of civil rulers, who made religion the stalking horse of their own ambition, that she was finally brought into bondage. The uprightness and integrity of a church are put to no inconsiderable trial by her having men of rank or opulence in her communion, even where these men are Christians. The Epistle of James shows that some churches, even in the Apostles' day, were drawn into sin from this cause. It is, of course, much more dangerous to a church to admit into her fellowship ungodly rich men, or to be in any important measure dependent on them for her support. But the danger is greatly increased when the church contracts alliance with an ungodly civil government. And if the terms of the alliance be such as to invest the rulers with any authority or control whatever in the appointment of the church's ministers, in other words, in the selection and choice of the persons who are to receive public support, that church must be regarded as being already in chains, and these not the less binding, that they are made of gold. A variety of circumstances may concur to modify or retard the effect of such an alliance, but the tendency of it is unalterable. The law of gravitation is not more uniform in its operation. A stone projected by a feeble force is instantly deflected from a straight line and brought to the earth. A piece of metal discharged from a cannon pursues for a time a path so nearly rectilinear that it might be almost held debatable whether it feels the force of gravitation. But a brief space will determine the dispute. The cannonball descends to the earth as surely as a pebble thrown by the hand of a child. Could we suppose a church in a healthy and sound state, having enlightened and zealous ministers and religion flourishing in her, suddenly brought into such an alliance as we have described? It is nothing improbable that, for a time, it might be difficult to discern any palpable change in her purity or efficiency. And yet this must very much depend on the circumstances of the case. There are remarkable instances on record of churches having sustained most serious damage by the very first contact with irreligious and crafty civil rulers. One of the most memorable and instructive of these, perhaps, was exhibited by the Church of Scotland at a time when the Scottish nation received home the young Prince Charles as their covenanted king after the death of his father, Charles I. In the year 1649, the Church of Scotland had reached the meridian of her Reformation attainments. Imperfections and blemishes no doubt still remained in her. It is in the world to come that the exalted Redeemer will, quote, present to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle, or any such thing, unquote. But for anything that authentic history records of her, we feel persuaded that the Church of Scotland, at the period to which we have referred, might bear a comparison with any other church of equal extent, equally well known, that has existed since the days of the Apostles. In the month of June 1650, Charles arrived in Scotland, and before 1 year had elapsed, the Church had begun to retrace the steps of Reformation she had just attained. At the earnest solicitation of the King and his councillors, the Commission of the General Assembly gave their consent to the repeal of some Acts of Parliament passed in the preceding year, with the view of excluding from places of trust or power persons who had incurred the censures of the Church by scandalous immorality of their lives or their notorious hostility to the Reformation. A majority of the members of the next General Assembly approved of the resolution of the Commission. Thus the door of admission into the Church, as well as into civil offices, was thrown open to the malignants, who, in order that they might qualify for places of power and emolument, went through a disgraceful scene of mock repentance. A lamentable division was created in the Church, at the time when increasing danger demanded the most cordial union. The more discerning and resolute minority, who deplored and testified against these defections, were on that account prosecuted with much rigor by the majority. Thus a multitude of good and pious men, who had fearlessly gone forward with the work of reformation in defiance of the threats of the first Charles, were now seduced by the blandishments and cunning of his son to lay their own hands rudely on the sanctuary, which they had been rearing with so much pious care, and even to make a chamber in the temple for Tobiah the Ammonite, by receiving the malignants into the fellowship of the Church. It is a historical fact that the very men into whose hands Charles now put the reins of government became his ready instruments 10 years afterward, in virtue of the authority with which they were now invested, both in subverting the civil liberties of the kingdom and in overturning the Reformation. In taking a theoretical view of the question now before us, we should hold it as very important that it be the unquestionable design and wish of those by whom the Church is supported that her ministers be faithful to their trust, and that it must inevitably be an ensnaring position, even for good men, to be dependent for their support on those who undoubtedly desire that they should temporize and consult expediency. In so far as this point alone is concerned, the influence on the character and conduct of ministers would be a happy one, whether their support be derived from Christian rulers or a Christian people, and on the contrary, the effect must be unhappy and pernicious, whether the support be derived from ungodly civil rulers or an ungodly multitude falsely called a Christian congregation.